The most obvious thing that differentiates reef aquariums or marine aquariums from any other type of aquarium is of course the fact that they are saltwater aquariums. We use them to house organisms from our oceans rather than organisms from rivers or lakes. Seawater is in fact the most abundant resource on Earth. Something like 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with it, and in many cases this is several miles deep. And you could be forgiven for thinking that this is a free resource for the reef keeper, there for the taking. Unfortunately, in the early days of marine fish keeping, it was discovered that this is not the case. Natural salt water harvested from the sea is full of impurities, pollution mainly put there by man. It also contains harmful pathogens and microorganisms and harmful bacteria, all of which can quickly get out of hand within the confines of a small reef aquarium, or even a large reef aquarium for that matter, which would quickly cause a situation that would harm the invertebrates and fish that you're trying to keep, and may even kill them. Now, some public aquariums, very few, but some public aquariums that are situated near to the sea will use natural seawater, but these are not closed systems. They have a water intake right out at sea, well away from the coastline, where it may pick up the worst of the pollution. The water is then very carefully and thoroughly filtered and purified. It's then pumped through the aquariums and then deposited straight back into the sea. It's not a closed system, it's a circulation of natural seawater. But most large-scale public aquariums use synthetic seawater, and so does the humble reef keeper. Now, the word synthetic is actually a little bit misleading, because most synthetic salt mixes are made up from natural elements taken from seawater. But this is rigorously cleaned and refined to pharmaceutical grade components, with various additives of major and minor trace elements, which create a clean, contaminant-free salt mix ready for you to use in your aquarium. Now, synthetic salt mixes are big business, and there are many brands to choose from. Generally speaking, they are all very good, although obviously some are better than others. But price isn't really a good indicator of what is better over, an inferior product. Many, in my opinion, are just plain overpriced. Now, the aquarium that we're going to be setting up later on is not a state-of-the-art SPS coral system, so you don't necessarily need to worry too much about buying the absolute best brand and mix of salt out there. The advice that I would give is just to stick with a major brand name that suits your pocket. Just make sure that it is a reef or coral friendly salt over a basic salt that's intended for fish. Now, I think by and large most salts sold nowadays are sold for reef use, so you should be okay. And your reef salts, generally speaking, do have a few extra additives intended to promote coral growth. Like most things in life, the more you buy, the cheaper it gets. Most manufacturers market these salts in various sized packaging, but when choosing such a size, ensure that you have enough to set your tank up and at least enough for 2 or 3 water changes. It's always sensible to have a little bit on hand after you've set your tank up. The other things that you're going to need in order to mix your salt up is a large bucket or container made from food grade plastic, preferably with a lid. As far as these buckets are concerned, I always found that your standard wine brewing buckets are the best for the job. They're not too expensive, they'll take the weight when you're carrying large amounts of water around, they're food grade, and they have resealable lids. You'll also need a heater and a pump. Now, for someone who's just keeping a small nano tank and that's it, what I would do is just buy a replacement pump for your tank and a replacement heater. These are things that you should have on hand anyway in case something goes wrong. And rather than them just sitting in a cupboard until the day when maybe you'll need them, you can use these for mixing your salt up. First things first, ensure that all your equipment is clean before you begin mixing. That means scrub your bucket out, even if it's a clean one, and even if it's had a clean salt mix in it previously and then sealed up. This helps to keep away harmful bacteria that you don't want. And you would also be amazed that if you don't clean your equipment, how much detritus ends up floating on the surface in your fresh mix, something that you want to avoid if you can. So clean out your bucket, only use normal tap water, nothing else, and thoroughly rinse and clean both your pump and your heater prior to the mixing process. Right, next we need to add the water to the bucket. That's just clean, fresh water. And the required amount needs to be dispensed into your bucket before any salt goes anywhere near it. And the water that you should be using is RO or reverse osmosis water. Now, I have my own RO unit. I've had it for years and I just replace the cartridges as necessary. But most aquatic centres do sell RO water and it's not terribly expensive. You're going to need RO for topping up for evaporation from your aquarium as it's running, and you need to use RO water for mixing up your salt. The reason being that there are a lot of contaminants in normal tap water. It may be fit for human consumption, but it's not quite up to the right grade for mixing up salt water for aquariums. The main problem's been that there's often a lot of nitrate in it, which can cause algal blooms. Tap water also contains chlorine and in some areas chloramines, which are used for keeping bacteria at bay in our drinking water. Basically, it is an antibacterial agent, so never use tap water for mixing up salt or for topping off your tank, something that we'll come to later on, because you're basically going to wipe out your filter with it. It's also not particularly good for fish and corals. Now, these buckets will usually hold about 30 to 32 litres, so I always mix up 25 litre batches at a time. Using a known quantity like this makes it much easier, because if you use the same known volume of water each time, you can calculate what volume of salt needs to be added to it. So it makes the whole mixing process much easier and takes all the unknown quantities out of it. And once you've dispensed that water into your bucket, put your pump in there and switch it on to get the water circulating. RO water, generally speaking, the process that it goes through is very devoid of oxygen when it comes out of the filter. So this will reoxygenate that water, and it's also going to assist with the mixing process. It's now time to add the salt, but first of all we need to weigh it to make sure that we're putting the right amount in. Now, I'd just like to add one caveat here. Different salt manufacturers have different specific requirements for mixing their salts up. Some require that they're up to temperature, some state that they must be mixed cold. The instructions that I'm giving you here are general. You should always follow what the manufacturer tells you to do. It will be something along these lines. It may just be a case of you having to heat the water up first before adding the salt, or it may be a case that you have to mix it up cold. Now, all these salt mixes are hygroscopic. This means that they will soak up moisture from the air. If you buy the buckets of salt, generally speaking, it's kept in a plastic bag inside. The cardboard boxes can be a little bit more problematic once they've been opened, so I tend not to use them. Make sure that you have something to reseal the bag after you've opened it to keep that moisture out while it's in storage waiting for your next mix. Also, when you buy a new mix of salt, manipulate the bag before opening it to ensure that all the contents are thoroughly mixed together. Sometimes during the packing process they don't mix it up as such, so you need to sort of swirl the bag around and manipulate it with your fingers in order to make sure that all the contents are blended together as much as possible. Make sure that your scales are zeroed before you commence measuring. You need to start at 0. a little operation that some people do forget to carry out, and then measure out 875 grams of salt. With most salt mixes, this will give you a perfect water mix with a specific gravity of 1.025 or a salinity of 34 parts per thousand. You're going to need some sort of device for actually ascertaining the specific gravity of your salt mix. I'll get onto that in a moment. It is worth taking your time to make sure that you get your salt weight and your volume of water as accurate as you can. It does save you some messing about adjusting it later on. And once you've got your salt measured out, it's time to add it to the water. Now, basically that water pump that you've got running in that bucket of water is going to do all the mixing for you. All you really have to do is add the salt. I can't stress enough, avoid just dumping it all in at once and then expecting the pump to do the work. This salt is funny stuff. If it clumps together, it will often refuse to mix. So the art of getting it to mix in properly is to basically just keep sprinkling amounts in a bit at a time in a way that stops large volumes of the salt from clumping together in the bottom of the bucket. Just take your time. It only takes a minute or two, but just take your time with it. Different manufacturers quote different mixing times. That is the amount of time it takes the salt to dissolve fully into the water. None of them are ever accurate. So I would always advise that you mix your water up 24 hours in advance. I generally do my water changes sort of mid-Friday mornings after I've uploaded my final video for the week on the motorcycle channel. So what I always do is I always do my salt mix first thing on a Thursday morning, sort of 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. This gives the water a full 24 hours and then some to mix in. And even though the manufacturer of the salt that I'm using at the moment quotes a very quick mixing time, I generally find that there is still some residue of that salt in the bottom of the bucket, anything up to 6 hours later. So don't believe what the manufacturer tells you regarding mixing times. The other problem with these salt mixes is that they can be quite harsh when they're first mixed up. It can irritate delicate gills on fish and delicate corals. So that 24 hours or more being constantly churned around by that pump sort of ages it and matures that salt water mix slightly and makes it much more fit for use. Now, depending on what your manufacturer says about using heated water or cold water, make sure that you put your heater in there and switch it on well in advance so that it is up to temperature when you're ready to do your water change. Of course, if you're mixing this up to fill your tank for the first time, that doesn't really matter. You can just let your heater in your tank heat it up. There's no livestock in your tank, so temperature isn't an issue. Just bear in mind that depending on the time of year and where you're actually mixing your water up, I use quite a cool, unheated sort of utility room for mixing my water. It may take up to 8 hours for the heater to get the water up to temperature, so you need to sort of build that into your schedule. While it's mixing, replace the lid. This just keeps any dirt or detritus from falling into it while it's mixing up and keeps your salt water mix clean, ready for use. Now, when it comes to actually measuring the salinity of your salt water mix, this is often temperature dependent. Specific gravity varies with the temperature of the water, and most devices designed for measuring specific gravity are calibrated to a certain temperature, usually around about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Swing needle hydrometers have been a popular choice for about 2.5 decades, and I personally have never had a problem with them. I think the only time I did have a problem and found one to be wildly inaccurate, it was a cheap Chinese one of a make I'd never heard of before, and it just didn't work out. Stick to a well-known brand. Now, the first time you use one of these, rinse it well with tap water several times. inside and out. It needs to be, for want of a better word, seasoned. What I normally do is I just drop it into a bucket of salt water for about 1 to 2 hours. Then you simply take a reading by filling it up to the specified level on the actual hydrometer and placing it on a level surface to take a reading. Now with these, you must make sure that there are no bubbles on the actual swing needle that indicates, that points to the specific gravity, because obviously bubbles are going to upset the reading. Just wrapping it with your knuckles a few times is usually enough to dislodge any bubbles from the needle itself. But you will find as they get older, the incidence of bubbles forming on the needle becomes less and less. It's usually a problem you have with them when they're new. Now, the latest trend seems to be refractometers. These have been around for decades. They used to be very expensive. They were like £100 plus. Prices have come down substantially, but they're still 4 or 5 times the price of a hydrometer, a swing needle hydrometer that is. Now, what I have noticed is that most aquatic centres have stopped stocking the swing needle type hydrometers, and they only stock the refractometers. Again, I think this is a money-making thing. We managed perfectly well with swing needle hydrometers for decades. You don't buy either hydrometers or refractometers very often, they can last for years. And it would seem to me that, again, this is a money-making thing. They want to grab as much money off you as they possibly can while you're in the market for getting some sort of salt measuring device. The good thing is, however, that there are still swing needle hydrometers available on the likes of Amazon. I'll leave a link for a couple that I know you can trust. You don't want to be blowing your brains out financially on your first setup. It's a learning curve. It's expensive enough as it is, and I don't think there's anything wrong with using a swing needle hydrometer, for your first stab at the hobby. The main thing is with these devices is to make sure that you're getting a consistent reading every time. Make sure that every batch of water you mix up is indicated by your hydrometer as being exactly the same as the last batch that you mixed up and every batch in the future. Consistency is the key to stability in a small aquarium. You'll be fine. Now, I know some people are going to be overfaced by this process initially. Plus, there's the expense of buying all these additional little bits of equipment. As an interim measure, when you first get started, most aquatic shops do sell pre-mixed salt water. I would still advise that you buy a hydrometer to A, check your own tank, and B, check that the salinity that they've mixed up for you is appropriate. Locally, to me, they charge about £5 for 25 litres of pre-mixed water, and there's nothing wrong with going down that route until you've gained a bit of experience and recovered from the initial purchase of your tank, etc. There's absolutely nothing wrong with buying water from your aquatic centre. Right, once again, thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate the growing number of people that are supporting this channel. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll be back next week where we will take a look at the sand that we're going to be using in our aquarium. So until then, take care and I'll see you soon.